It gives me great pleasure to introduce to you none other than, and wherever you are in the world, would you please join me in giving a warm round of applause for none other than Madeline Bocaro. How are you?
I'm great. Thank you so much for having me.
Absolutely. Thank you. Thank you for availing yourself for the Imagine That with Robin Richie podcast.
My pleasure.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Why don't you tell us, Madeline, a little bit about yourself?
Well, I am a New Yorker, and I've always loved music, rock and roll specifically. And I've been to many, many, many concerts as a kid in the 70s and going all the way up till now. And I always wanted to write about music, and I always wrote down what the concert was like the next day, wrote the set list and every song they did and everything they wore, because I really love these people. And I have a whole big collection of writings that is now on a blog. It's on a music blog called MadelineX.com. And I also was fascinated with Yoko Ono since I was 10 years old and started collecting everything I could find about her. And that was since 1968. So I had this wealth of information. And one day, my boyfriend gave me software and he said, "Why don't you put all what you have into this software and see what you have?" And I had a 500-page book, which took me 2 more years to put together.
And that's absolutely fantastic.
I used to work at CMJ, which was College Media Journal, in the late 70s, early 80s, and they compiled playlists from all the college radio station who would call in every month. And there was a good pulse on what was happening in the youth market and what was popular and being played. So I got to interview a lot of great people, musicians and bands at the time, and got to go to a lot of more shows that way. But then when I had to get a real job to support myself, I had to put writing on the back burner a little bit. But I always wrote for myself. And all these writings are now on my blog, MadelineX.com. And then I contributed to a lot of documentaries and articles on different bands and people, because the writers would end up finding me eventually because I was the well-known fan of these bands and I had a wealth of information. So they would always interview me for those things as well. And a couple of Bowie books and a documentary of Mick Ronson and one on Klaus Nomi and a book on Yoko in the 80s that was very superficial, just touched on her life really, but I contributed a little bit to that one. And, over the years, just contributing and writing some articles for Discoveries and Goldmine and consulting for Mojo and things, but mostly for myself. I didn't want to have any editors. I wanted to write what I wanted to write about. Didn't want any assignments, and I only write about things I like and love. Because if I don't like it, what am I going to say? Somebody else likes it, so let them write about it. That's my little philosophy.
And clearly, because you've been doing this for decades, so clearly something's working.
Yeah, well, I guess you just follow your dream and follow your path and it becomes a reality. So same thing happens with the book.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think because of the fact that you are an admirer of Ms. Ono, I think that is why it is so wonderfully and thoughtfully written.
Well, I knew what was important. She's a very brilliant person. She's a trailblazer. She was way ahead of her time. She was totally misunderstood. And she just had so many important things to say that I wanted to get those out into the world. And I used mostly her own voice in the book because I collected all these articles and radio shows and things that she had spoken only about her own self and her own art, when the majority of the interviews were about John Lennon or the Beatles. So
Sure.
I had a collection, and I knew what I wanted to bring forth, especially her spirit. She's just a very positive, very spiritual. She's almost magical in a way. She's so intuitive. And she looks at things from a whole different dimension. She has a view of the world that, like, she thinks of in terms of a billion universes, when we might be just thinking of our neighborhood, and maybe we take a trip to Europe in our life, but she's way out there. She's seeing things from way beyond. And that's what John loved about her. She opens up worlds for him. And especially, like, she could see negative space. She had this art piece called Half a Wind Show, and she would put cut objects in half and put them all in a room and painted them white. And we're seeing the objects that are there, but she's showing us the half that's missing. So that's what she sees. In school, she had to listen to the ticking of a clock and write down the rhythm, but she was hearing the silences in between the ticking. So that's what fascinated me about her mind. You know, she'd see things that weren't there.
And when she was coming of age, and I want to talk a little bit about her origin.
She was born in Japan, Tokyo, 1933. And her family was one of the 3 wealthiest families in all of Japan. It came from her great-grandfather founded the Bank of Japan, and he was a billionaire banker. And he was actually assassinated by a rebel. So here's this guy, you know, who was doing good for the world, just like John Lennon, and he was assassinated. And when John visited to meet Yoko's family for the first time, he saw a picture of her great-grandfather, and he said, "Whoa, this guy looks like me. He has almond-shaped eyes. I think he was me in a past life." And Yoko says, "Don't say that. He was assassinated." So there's all these kind of weird, freaky things going on too, where a lot of connections, a lot of premonitions in her life. And, you know, her mother was the Yasuda, descended from this great-grandfather. Her father was an Ono, and he married into her family. He was going to be a classical pianist, but, you know, he had to give that up to marry into her family. And he was sent to America for work when she was born. And Yoko didn't meet her father till she was almost 2.5 years old. And her mother would give him a picture of him every night to say goodnight to. And her mother was a socialite, basically. You know, she was very wealthy. She was into jewelry and clothing. She was a brilliant woman. She did play several musical instruments. She was a good artist. But, you know, she didn't really have any warmth or affection for Yoko. And she was raised by servants, and they called her Miss. And she didn't have any playmates her age. It was a very lonely, lonely childhood. And then by the time she was 12, came the bombings of Tokyo by America. And she had 2 siblings by then, younger siblings, and she had to be evacuated to the countryside for safety with them. And it was a horrible situation because her mother had paid for them to stay in this farmhouse that she thought was in better condition than it really was. It was run down, half finished. It had a hole in the roof. And they were sent with jewels and kimono silk to trade for food. But the wealthy, them being wealthy was a turnoff to I guess they were kind of peasants in that area. And people threw stones at them, and they wouldn't give them food. And it was really a nightmare. And she had to pick berries off the trees to feed her siblings, and they were hungry all the time. And the whole basis of her artwork, which was imagining things in your mind, was when her little brother was crying because he was hungry. And she said, "Well, what do you want to have?" And he said, "Ice cream." And she said, "Well, what flavor?" "Oh, chocolate." "Well, picture the chocolate is in an ice cream cone, like how," and he was smiling and he was getting all excited. And she's like, "Wow, look what you can do with the power of your mind."
Yes.
So this is the basis of everything for her.
It's amazing. And she's been a rebel. all her life.
It came naturally for her. She didn't set out, put on a holster and a gun and become a rebel. She was just, when she was a child, she had all these brilliant ideas. Like she thought that if you planted two seeds from two different trees together, that you might get a tree with oranges and lemons on it. Or, I mean, that is kind of done now. There are hybrid trees, but back then she was 4 years old. She was thinking of these things. And she always felt like Madame Curie, like she was an inventor. She thought of all these things for healing purposes or, just to get yourself through life. And she had hardships beginning in childhood, then she grows up and her ideas aren't understood by anyone. She's too avant-garde. So they're telling her, oh, you better seek out these avant-garde people in New York. And even then the world was men, all men in the arts, all men in the music field. And her father even told her he wanted her to be a pianist and she didn't want that. She wanted to compose. And he said, oh, there are no women composers. So she came from this world where women were nobody, so she was constantly subjugated and told to be quiet, and she was having none of it. And when her parents moved to New York for her father's business, she did seek out those people in New York, and she became kind of like the center of it because she found a loft space where all of them could perform. Because back then there was only jazz clubs. There weren't really any places for avant-garde performers. So she opened up her space and they all came, they all played, they all performed, the artists displayed their work. And this was like the first kind of meltdown where she got all these different artists together in one place to play. So that was monumental. But then, she meets John Cage, and her first husband was working with John Cage at the time. And she ends up touring Japan with them. But it's a man's world, and she becomes very, very despondent and literally tries to commit suicide because she's just not being heard. Right. And then she's found by her second husband, who's an American entrepreneur, and he had heard about her work, and he went to Japan to seek her out, and he finds her in this hospital, and he gets her released and becomes her promoter. And that's when they moved to New York first, and she's gaining a name in New York. She did some films, and even the avant-garde world was kind of rejecting her because her little film became a little bit too popular for them, and they were, not liking that. So they went to Japan and worked there. And then they moved to London to see if they could get her an exhibition. And sure enough, they get one at this Indica gallery where the owner, John Dunbar, knew the Beatles. He was friends of them, and he brought John Lennon to the gallery on the night before her opening. And she was kind of upset that he brought anyone there because she wanted it to be a surprise for the opening. She wanted everything to be neat and clean. And John started, playing with her artwork. There was an apple on a stand. That was her idea of, using nature as an art form. I mean, what's more beautiful than nature? Why isn't it art? And you can watch it decompose. That's the whole work. It's going to change. It's always nothing's permanent. It's just going to decompose. So John takes a bite of the apple, and she was mortified. She's like, what? Who is this guy? And literally, she hadn't heard of the Beatles. And people don't believe this, but she's born in 1933. She grows up in the 30s and 40s. Rock and roll doesn't even exist yet.
Right.
She doesn't have a record collection or posters on her walls. She's listening to Japanese music, no theater, kabuki, and she was not aware. She's in Japan and no clue about Beatles, except she peripherally heard about them. So she's telling John Dunbar, why'd you bring this guy? And he says, look, he's a millionaire. He might buy something. He's a Beatle. She's like, I don't know. Is he that important? I wasn't really sure. But John interacted with some of her work. And the thing that he loved the most was a white ladder that went to the ceiling with, there's a painting, a canvas on the ceiling with a small word written on it. And there's a magnifying glass hanging down. So he climbs up there and he looks at it, and it said, yes. And he was like really weary of all these pretentious artists at the time. And this was something that said something positive to him, and he was drawn in. He loved it. And he from then on, they really clicked. But they didn't get together for 18 months because they were each married. Each of them had a child. And she knew this was something big and heavy because she started realizing how famous he was. And she was an independent artist. She didn't want to collaborate with anyone or sidetrack her work.
Now, you said something very interesting, because I really did not know that Ms. Ono had been married twice before.
Yes.
Previously. So that's something that's not really common knowledge.
Right.
I don't believe.
Yeah, well, she was 33 when she met John. She wasn't a teenager, she's 8 years older than him. And yeah, she married Toshi Ichinaki, who was a very well-known avant-garde composer in Japan up until he died a year ago. And he was very, very fond of her and her work, and they stayed cordial. He really admired her work. And then the second one was Tony, who he had the daughter with.
Yes. And what's very interesting, I absolutely do believe that she didn't know who John was, because I have in my day met individuals who were sports figures. I came to learn were very, very famous. And I might have been the only person under the roof at the time who didn't know who they were. I just suspected that they were someone because they were like 6 foot oblivion. You know what I mean?
Yeah, if they're not in your field, maybe you're just so wrapped up in your own work, in your own field, that not paying attention to something that's not really, you've outgrown your teens. You're not really familiar with who's on the scene right now.
Right. And I buy it. I believe it. I mean, I was never athletically inclined with the exception of dance. So that's why I use that example. I'm not the sports person. Only in recent years, I have actually gone to my first basketball game within the last decade, the first baseball game you know what I mean? So yeah. I completely, but yet throughout my life, I have been in different circles with different figures that, to be perfectly honest with you, was a bit embarrassing because I didn't know who they were. I didn't know that, but to them, I believe it was refreshing. Yeah. Because we were just able to vibe and have regular conversation.
Right.
And then,
well, that's what John loved. He was so happy that she wasn't enamored by him or worshiping him because of who he was. They were humans on a human level. And they had a lot in common. He had parental abandonment when he was a child. His parents left him. His father went away to sea, and his mother gave him to his aunt to raise him. And he didn't even know his mother until he was a teenager. And then she got killed right when they were becoming close. She got hit by a car and died. Wow. So they both had this extreme loneliness and a quirkiness and
brilliance.
Excuse me?
And brilliance.
Brilliance, yes. They were both highly intelligent and felt like nobody else understood them. And when they met, they found their other half, basically. But they didn't get together for a while because of the heaviness of the situation. And then when they finally got together and he told her he was going to leave the Beatles, she panicked because he said, "It's just you and me now." And could you imagine, anybody, you're anybody, and John Lennon says this to you, and she's thinking, well, wait a minute, what's he going to be preoccupied with while I'm doing my work? Because she was.
No, I would say, please don't do that.
Yeah, she was. She was on that track. She was just born to do what she did. She didn't deviate from it. She was just driven to do this work. And the message was always love and peace and healing, empowering of women, to showing us our misplaced values. just enlightening everybody, because she really came from another place. She knew how we should be living. She's telling us that water is more valuable than gold. It's so obvious, but do we even think about that? You know, we're all misguided, and all these rituals we do and things we try to believe in, it's things that are bad for our health instead of following our own intuition. So she really, that's why I use a lot of words from her in the book, where, you know, she'll tell you, the problem you think you have might be helping you. It's the way you look at the problem. Mm-hmm. You know, just different things where she turns things on end and makes you see how they really should work.
Which is one of the reasons why you chose the title that you did.
In your mind, yes.
Right. The infinite universe.
Infinite universe. Right.
She's very, very forward thinking. And it's not something that even today isn't really encouraged, as quiet as it's kept, you know, for women. So to me, she's always been very courageous.
She has. She probably doesn't think of it that way, though. She's just doing her work. To her, it's work.
Right.
But it's just that she was ahead of her time, you know, whether it was her ideas, or her fighting for women's rights, or being an Asian woman marrying an English guy. People hated her for that. There was just so many things that she got put down for, which was so unfair. You know,
why do you think that it was? Why do you think even to this day, people love to use Miss Ono as a scapegoat?
It's because so many lies were written about her in the press. It started in England, of course, when she got together with John. And people were told to make out lies to sell papers at the time. So this is what people are familiar with. This is what they pass on to possibly their children. I've heard young people saying crazy things about her, which they shouldn't even. It's all lies, and they're repeating these lies. So that's why I wanted to put this book out. It's a beautiful person that's being wronged, and I just wanted to give her voice.
And that's a wonderful, wonderful thing. And we have some other images that I would love to share with our viewers. And I have flashed a few, which are younger images. Right. And this looks like this is 2 or 3 year old Yoko, correct?
Yes, it is. She's this is right around the time she met her father for the first time. And as you see, she's a beautiful woman, and people call her ugly. It's just mind-boggling how they got away with all of that. You can't go on television now and say, oh, here's Nicole Kidman, isn't she ugly? You know, you can't.
Right. Well, she's accomplished, being a filmmaker, being a performing artist, singer, songwriter, just so many things. And it's amazing because again, we talked about courage earlier. When it seems like the world almost is against you, sometimes that can just be so disheartening when you're just trying to forge your way above and beyond those things, just to be who you are, you know?
Well, she described it as just like a lot of little stabs, like acupuncture. And eventually all the negativity, she learned how to deflect it, and it became healing for her. Yes. And that's how she dealt with it. Otherwise, she really would have killed herself. Nobody could endure what she went through, especially having her husband shot in front of her eyes, and at a time where they were really happy. They had a child. They were just starting to go on tour with the new album, you know, and then that song that you're talking about was the cassette that John was holding the night he was killed. He had been playing it the whole night before, over and over. They were just finishing it up. and he loved it. And he even said, this is going to be your first number one. And it wasn't at the time, but decades later, it became a number one on Billboard's dance charts. So it's a very eerie song. You know, it's about risk and just a very fragile state of mind.
Right.
And it was very, very ahead of its time. Again, even in the 80s, this is one of the first songs that sounded like an 80s song, you know, and it was made in 1980.
Sure.
So it was an intense situation. She put it out about a month after John was killed.
I'd like to talk a little bit about her decision, the album that she put out afterwards, and her decision to use his glasses.
Yeah.
Do you know which one I'm referencing? Of course, yes.
It's called Season of Glass, and
Correct.
it was she put the bloody glasses on the cover in a little scenario where there was a glass half empty and half full of water. It was by the window their bedroom window that overlooked Central Park, where they walked every day and loved being there so much. And it was just a statement that, you know, this is what I had to live through. And this is what was done to John. And she believes that John would have put the same picture on the cover himself. That's just, you know, she said people all their lives were trying to split them up. And they spent all of their energy trying to stay together. And in the end, people split them up in this big way. And it's just showing what was done.
Now, you know, I didn't know that backstory. So thank you for sharing that with us.
Okay.
But when in my research, and I learned about this, and I, you know, the level of criticism that she received. And, you know, it's interesting because the first person who came to my mind was, bless her soul, Jackie Onassis.
Right. Who did the
who
same
chose to keep that same suit on because it was her way of letting the nation know what had happened to her husband.
Exactly.
Yet she was hailed for making that decision. Why do we have unbalanced scales sometimes? What do you think? What are your thoughts?
This is mostly to do with the Beatles. Beatles fans are rabid. The Beatles are great. I love the Beatles. But I also loved Yoko, and I love that she was with John. I loved everything they did together. But these Beatle people can't, they think she broke them up, which is not true. They think he should have stayed with his first wife and child, which he couldn't do because they grew apart. And some of these people thought maybe they were going to marry John Lennon themselves.
Mm-hmm.
It's that crazy, you know? And girls would throw things at her and pull her hair and say very nasty things to John. They told John, be careful, she'll slit your throat in the night. It just insanity. They sent him voodoo dolls with pins in them in the shape of Yoko. So this is just insanity.
Wow. It's amazing. The Queen of Scream.
Yeah, that's my chapter about her musical influences and her whole MO and why she does what she does.
Let's talk about it.
Yeah, it comes from, if you listen to Japanese music, not pop music like these days, but, you know, kabuki theater, no theater, it's all very emotive and shrill and dark somewhat. It's very, to our ears, Western ears, it's kind of disturbing in, you know, minor keys, dissonant. And this is what she was kind of, her ear was used to. But the reason she was doing the screaming is because she was a little girl, and she was told not to go near the servants' quarters because there were adults in there, teenagers who were servants as well, talking, and her mother didn't want her to hear any adult talk. But she snuck near there one day, and there was a girl talking about her aunt had given childbirth. And she said, I was in the next room and I heard my aunt screaming, and she was going, ah, and she's emulating what this aunt sounded like. Now, in Japan, you weren't even supposed to smile in a photograph. This is how demure you were supposed to be as a girl or a woman. And for her to hear this loud shrieking, it really had an effect on her. And she thought, wow, a woman has the power to give birth to a child. This is a huge power. And yet we're told to be, quiet. They want us to sing a pretty song. They want us to dance for them, but I'm not going to do that. I'm going to be me. So this is the root of it anyway.
Amazing. Sean.
Sean is her biggest fan. Sean is the greatest. He's like heaven sent, because he's like a mini John. He loves her more than anyone else in the world. He is a musician now, and he produces her records, and he re-releases her old albums and new packaging and remastered. He totally understands her whole philosophy, and he just worships her. And it's wonderful, because without him, she wouldn't be alive today. And he's really supportive of my book as well. He's just over the moon about it. He loves it.
Yep. Yes, here are a few images of both yourself and Sean, as well as Yoko. And the gentleman is a very close family friend also.
Right. He's Elliot Mintz. He met them in 1971 when he heard Yoko's album and played it on his radio show in LA. And he loved it so much that he called her. She called him actually to thank him for playing it. And he was thrilled that she had called him. And then the next day she called him again and again and again. She just kind of like had a feeling about him, like she just liked him a lot. And then eventually introduced him to John, and he became like their third wheel. And because they didn't have a lot of friends, everybody they knew kind of betrayed them. They couldn't really, trust anyone. So he was their spokesperson in a way. And then when John passed away, he became Yoko's spokesperson and publicist. And to this day, he's still her protector. And he has a book coming out in a while, so that's going to be great, his memoir.
Oh, that's going to be interesting.
But he calls my book the best thing ever written about Yoko. I mean, obviously, not just because it's the first book to be totally complete. It's the Bible of Ono. That's what it's been called. And, not just her life, but there's a chapter about every album and every song. There's the work with John and without John. There's the time before, during, and after. Everything is explained in detail. And it's not just for the sake of detail. It's just because every detail is very, very interesting. So, there's chapters about her feminism and her activism and just all of the work and what it means. And it's so meaningful and so important that it had to be done.
I looked at some old footage and a performance. Well, actually, it was an appearance on the Conan O'Brien.
That's funny.
And I loved this. I just thought it was so cool, right? And, I'm a multidisciplinary artist, right? And so, the concepts about the bagism and the bedisms, and she actually did the bagging. And Conan didn't know what on earth, like, what are we going to do? And she had him climb into this black cloth sack with her. And then they started removing clothing. I loved it.
Yeah, well, that stemmed from her being very shy when she was younger. And she thought, well, if you couldn't see somebody, you would just get to know them for who they are and there wouldn't be any prejudice. And that was the whole basis of the bagism.
Sure. If she were doing what she's already done, but if it were now, if this were coming about in 2024, what do you think the reception would be?
Well, there's a huge retrospective exhibition of her work going on right now at the Tate Modern in London. And it started a couple of weeks ago. And people are loving it. They're going through these white rooms, immersed in her world, absorbing her wisdom, seeing her films, listening to the music, interacting with the art. And it's just incredible, the reaction. Like, people are saying, oh, this is what she's about. We didn't know, they just weren't paying attention to her before at all. And now that it's all laid out for them in this day and age, it's just a time where people are just more receptive, especially younger people who don't have those years and years of horrible newspaper memes, lies thrown at them constantly. And people are bringing their young children, like little kids, and they're loving it. What little kid could go to a museum and actually play with the stuff and touch it and feel it and have an interaction?
It's beautiful.
Yeah.
It's beautiful. Very controversial. We know this, right? Why do you think some of the members had a change of heart after so many years of the group, the Beatles?
Why did they break up, or what did
No.
It's Yoko.
After so many years, Paul had some very there were some very lovely things,
right,
that
Paul
were said about her, and giving her credit for
saving John. Really,
how
he realized. He realized, even from the beginning, if you listen to the song Hey Jude, it's supposedly about Paul writing about John's son Julian, who was lonely when he went off with Yoko. But if you listen to the lyrics, he's saying, take a sad song and make it better. Remember to let her into your heart. Remember, you're waiting for someone to perform with. All these lines are about, okay, go with Yoko. I get it now. He was just angry in the beginning because John was bringing her to the studio every day. And that was because John wanted her there. She didn't want to be there. She was knitting. She was reading. She was very bored. She was thinking about her next artwork, what she was going to be doing. He wanted her in the studio. So what, but they made a big deal out of it. Look, think about it. They were in their early 20s at the time. All of those guys. Yes. They were kids, and they were just at each other's throats all the time. And they were having managerial problems, financial arguments. It was just all coming down, and they couldn't handle the pressure. And John said, I'm leaving. And Paul didn't want it to end. Actually, Ringo had left the group first, and they got him back. Then George walked out during the Let It Be sessions, and they got him back. And then John finally did it himself. That's it. Right. So Yoko really had nothing to do with it, except she was there. Paul had Linda at the time. Linda was coming too. Not every day, but she was there. So Paul, he's changing his tune. I mean, he's older now, and he reflects on it. And he said that, he and John had a very complicated, competitive relationship. And both of their mothers died when they were teenagers. Paul's mother as well, as cancer. So they had that bond, but they also were very, very competitive. And John got a little strange. He was bitter because Paul had said bad things about Yoko, and he could never forget it. So there was that. And but after John was killed, Paul said, and it's in my book, he said that it was only after John was killed that I realized that he really liked me, and talking to Yoko really comforted me, because she made me realize that John had this chip on his shoulder, but he really did love me and the music that I made. And that was all really Paul ever wanted to hear from John, but John would never give him that satisfaction. But when John and Yoko split up in the mid-70s, Paul was actually instrumental in getting them back together. He went to Yoko and he said, look, what's going on? Do you want, you should be together. Do you love him still? And she said, yeah, but they came to a breaking point. And she said, if he wants to come back, he has to start from scratch. He has to date me again. And he has to, start over. So Paul said, well, do you mind if I go and tell him this? And she said, go ahead. And that's what started it. And they definitely got back together.
But we don't hear that.
No, we don't hear it. Actually, it wasn't made public until 2010 when Yoko told a magazine about it. And even then, it came out in that magazine and nobody ran with it because nobody wants to believe this story that Paul helped, that.
Why is it that the world always wants everyone at odds?
It's the world, the way the world is. It's terrible. There are good people in the world and we don't understand any of that. And then there's the majority who, they think they're loving someone. We love John, but we hate Yoko. Well, that's not possible. It's not. You don't hate somebody that he loves, who nurtured him, who saved him in every way.
Right. Fascinating. When you began your career, and there are a lot of other people that of which you've written about and you've contributed to articles and other publications, and clearly you've been very successful with what you've been doing because it landed you in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame library and archives with this novel. So congratulations.
Thank you so much.
Yes, and that's not the only honor.
Yeah, my success, though, most people who are successful have a lot of money. But my success is that, not that I didn't care about the money because I had to work to support myself, but I wanted to do all this so badly that I just did it anyway. And the reason that I don't care about the money is because I couldn't have done it my way if I was paid. I would have to conform. And the thing people love about my writing is that it's just so free, and I'm passionate, and I talk about things that they could never be a part of, and they feel like they were there, and they're just really appreciative that I'm doing it. And then the artists themselves, are happy that I'm bringing out the meanings in their work, or, things that most people wouldn't really pick up on, or even the humor in it. Some of these artists are really hilarious what they do. So I was bringing that. Yoko's very humorous too.
Yes, I've seen that.
And I put that in the book also. A lot of her little humorous aspects.
I've seen that. Very, very interesting. Very playful. Very, very unlike what a lot of people would think.
Right. But if you look at her and John, they're all smiling and laughing, and they did the bed-ins for peace. And in a way, that was a very serious thing they were doing, but they put a light spin on it to kind of, show people like you can get peace without picking up a gun. Let's just think about peace, and your positive thoughts can change the world, your positive actions, and we should all be thinking about this together. And so they said, we'll be the clowns for peace, just so we'll get you thinking about it. And the cameras were going to be on them anyway. It was right after they got married. It was their actual honeymoon. And they said, okay, we're going to be in a honeymoon at a hotel. Let's let the press in here and let's make a stand and throw out a message. And that's what they did, and tried to change the world. They really, really wanted to change the world for the better, and everybody gave them hell for it.
Right. let's take a look at some of these controversial album covers. How about that?
Okay, so
Well, actually, not just the cover, pardon me, but not just the album covers, but certainly the cover of Rolling Stone. Do you remember? Well, of course you do. I remember when this hit the presses.
right. It's you know what John said to the photographer, Annie Leibovitz, you've captured our relationship exactly. She was
Yes.
like a mother figure to him. He's wrapped up around her like an embryo, right? He's just naked, he's just surrendered to
Vulnerable.
her. And this was the most important person in his whole life. And that's what he wanted to show. I mean, and that was the day he was killed.
Can you imagine? No.
No, it's horrible.
Right. Right. It's amazing because that being in that fetal position, it's almost as if he came full circle,
Right.
right?
Exactly.
A lot of metaphors, a
He
lot
always said that he would have wanted to die first because he couldn't live without her.
of how poetic. Beautiful and real. Women's History Month. I salute you. That's another reason why you're on the show
You too?
tonight. Thank you. It's wonderful to be able to create a platform that you can be successful in and enjoy. You
Yeah.
know, it's just awesome. And be a woman in a day and age, because again, the things that Yoko experienced 50, 60, 70 years ago, we're still dealing with today in a lot of instances, you know.
Yeah. Some things are better. I mean, women have higher positions now. They're in every field, but there's still that.
Work to be done.
Yeah, exactly. I
It's
mean,
work.
she was working on it since her grandmother was a feminist. She had a group in Japan, and they were called the Blue Steps, named after the group in England that was the Blue Stockings. And her mother, although she was all into jewelry and all that, she was a very strong woman too. And John had all strong women in his life, his mother and her sisters. So, and Yoko always like points out that in animal societies, the queen bee is the worker, and the mantis and the dragonfly eat their mates after copulation.
Right,
Because they're
right.
useless, and the male seahorse lays the eggs. There's all these reversals. But I can read you a quote from her about asking men to use their feminine side. She's always about that, to soften the men a little bit, not to make the women militant, because that's not what what we should be doing.
Right.
Because I'm living with a man, and I don't think the final answer is to create a totally female nation and enslave men. In 2,000 years, they carefully cultivated women who would be favorable to them, like a domesticated animal. They would select women who are not threatening women, who are smaller and not that intelligent. And the very intelligent radical women didn't get married. This has gone on for 2,000 years until finally we became what we are. Women are capable of this sort of thing too, but of course that's not the final answer. We fall in love and we appreciate men as human too. And she sympathizes with men because society is set up so that superiority is instilled in men. So they run with that, and
Right.
they have condescending towards women. And she always says, you ask any woman, no woman ever went through penis envy. We never did. The books say we're supposed to, but look who wrote the book. Never had penis envy, but men do have womb envy because we are directly connected to life and we give life. So she's always we're the powerful ones, right?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yes, yes. And you know what one of the reasons why I thought that it was important to have you on during our Women's History Month celebration, there's something that I know that you want to share with our viewers. There's a series, something that
Doing
you
a
have.
6-part series of interviews with this podcast called Backstage Pass. This woman, Kristen Hilaire Glasgow, and she's doing all these nice 20-minute segments with me about Yoko, and it's getting some recognition. So that's going to help, I think, get the word out there about the book and Yoko and all her wonderful, wonderful messages that we all need to learn from.
Absolutely, absolutely. What would you say to women who are watching this broadcast? And what tidbits can we leave for women watching?
For women watching, the fight isn't over. You can learn a lot from the book. Let me show you. Just look at this face, right? I mean, this woman, she just fights for good all around, and especially for women. And there's just so much to learn and so much to heal. She's a healer. She's always thinking about mending the world, putting things back together, mentally and physically, just a very healing person. She's a humanitarian. She's caring. She responds to every person that writes her a letter. There was a girl who wrote to her and said that John was killed on her birthday, December 8th. And Yoko wrote back to this girl and said, don't think of this as a sad day. Think of it as the day that John's spirit was set free to travel the universe. And then she continued to send this girl a birthday card on December 8th every year for decades, even though it was the most horrible day of her life.
Yes.
So this is just the goodness of her soul. And this is by an Australian artist. She had done this. I saw it as a greeting card and I loved it and asked her if I could use it. And she said, yes, I tweeted it once. And Yoko said she loved it too. So please use it. So her name is Kat McInnes. And there we go. That's Yoko.
Well, I think it's wonderful. I think it's wonderful. The book is wonderful. The illustrations. What can we look forward to from you?
From me, people want me to make my blog into a book. And that would be massive. So it might be an ebook. I don't know. We'll have to see. But right now, I'm so busy promoting this book. I want people to read it. I mean, it took me years and years of my life. It exists. And now people need to really embrace it. It's getting amazing reviews. People are calling it, as I said, the Bible of Ono. Someone said the page after page of wonder. I always say it's like opening a million fortune cookies with incredible messages that you can really use. I mean, all her words of wisdom are really useful, and it's healing. People are saying they appreciate her cosmic consciousness, and you can just learn. I highlight this whole era of the 60s and 70s when they were really doing a lot of work, and a lot of people know all the characters in the story. There are quotes from Pete Townsend, Paul McCartney, Phil Spector, John and Yoko and Sean, just a lot of people who were around at the time. And it just brings it all to light. There's a lot of stuff going on underneath all the stories that you already know that was very important and fascinating. Her whole life is a fascinating life.
Absolutely. She's been a fascinating woman. She is a fascinating woman. And so are you.
Thank you.
And what we're doing, what you're doing, you are creating avenues of information and pathways and connecting bridges of different generations. So all the best to you with this and all of your other endeavors. And I want to just flash this. I think this is how we can get in contact with you, or
That's the book's website.
order a book, perhaps.
Yeah, you can read the reviews on there, order from there. You get all the information right there.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
Fantastic. Well, Madeline Bocaro, I thank you. You're welcome.
Robin. I really appreciate it. And it's beautiful meeting you, and carry those vibes with you everywhere you go.
Oh, thank you, darling. Listen, this is all we can do. You, we have one life that we're working through now. Do it to the best of your ability. You know, I'm one for integrity and authenticity.
That's it.
And this is one of the reasons why I've always dug Miss Ono. When all of this is over, your work is what will remain. Exactly. So, right? You know, so you're a dear. Thank you. And you're also welcome anytime to the Imagine That with Robin Richie podcast platform. And all the best to you.
Thank you, Robin. And thanks to Spencer for introducing us.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And you keep rocking and rolling.
You too. Keep up. Keep on
Thank
keeping
you.
on. Okay.
Thank you so much. And viewers and listeners, thank you once again. You have been logged on to Imagine That with Robin Richie. See you next time. Bye-bye now. So, ladies and gentlemen, you know how to reach me. And if you don't, follow me on Instagram. On Instagram, my handle is They Call Me Miss Richie. And on Facebook, you can find me here, of course, on my Robin Richie page. I also have the Imagine That with Robin Richie podcast page. Thank you, all of you who have recently elected to follow the page. And thank you for supporting the endeavors of this podcast. And I'd love to take this opportunity to also remind you that this year makes the 26th season of the brand Imagine That with Robin Richie. So I want to thank you for helping to continue that. And we are committed to quality programming that inspires, educates, uplifts, and motivates.